Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the ancient streets of Rome, where lamplight spills across cobblestones slick from an evening rain, and the air carries the warm scent of bread from a baker's open window. You pause, hearing the muffled laughter of dinner guests behind painted shutters, and somewhere in the darkness, the soft creak of a carriage wheel turning down a narrow alley. You're not here for the Colosseum or the triumphal arches. No, your steps are drawn to the velvet shadows, the places polite conversation pretends not to know exist. Tonight, the Marble City will show you a side that the Senate would rather you believe is gossip, and the poets would rather you discover for yourself. And you probably won't survive this without questioning a few assumptions about what civilized really means. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, tell me in the comments your location and local time right now, because it's strangely comforting to imagine where all of you are as the story winds on. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your sandals scuff over worn stones as you move deeper into the city's underbelly, away from the chatter of the forum and the marble perfection of temples. Here, ivy clings to the walls of insulae, those tall, rickety apartment blocks where linen hangs from every balcony and the smell of simmering lentils mixes with damp stone. In the half-light, you spot a doorway framed by heavy curtains, the kind you've seen in the homes of wealthy merchants. Behind them lies not a shop or a dining room, but a private triclinium where guests recline on couches, drinking wine diluted not nearly enough for respectability. A mainstream fact you can't avoid. The Romans, for all their love of law and order, tolerated a staggering range of private behaviors, so long as they didn't threaten the public order. That boundary between what's allowed in daylight and what thrives in darkness is what you're stepping over right now. You ease into the corner of the room, unnoticed, as a serving boy offers figs to a reclining matron whose rings could pay the rent for half the block. The soft plucking of a lyre in the background almost hides a quieter transaction taking place. A handoff of a small wax tablet under the couch's edge, a promise for later, perhaps in coin, perhaps in favors. A quirky tidbit surfaces in your mind. Certain neighborhoods in Rome were nicknamed after animals like the wolf's den, not because of actual wildlife, but because of the residents' reputations for certain after-hours entertainments. You can't help but smirk at the idea that someone's address alone could hint at their nightlife habits. Beyond the curtain, the street hums with other quiet arrangements. A group of young men strolls past, each wearing a different colored stripe on their tunics, a subtle code that only certain circles would understand. One of them glances back toward the triclinium, catching sight of someone inside and giving the faintest nod an invitation or a warning. You can't quite tell. In the back of your mind, you recall that historians still argue whether the darker side of Rome was truly as pervasive as the surviving sources suggest, or whether satirists and scandal-hungry gossip simply amplified the extremes. After all, Juvenal made a career out of painting the city as a carnival of corruption, but satire has a way of stretching shadows. You follow the movement of a servant girl slipping between the couches, her hands steady despite the drunken laughter around her. She refills cups, accepts whispered instructions, and vanishes through a side door that you notice leads not to a kitchen, but down a narrow, torch-lit hall. Your feet almost move of their own accord. The hallway is close, lined with mosaic walls depicting scenes of feasts and hunts, at least at first. The further you go, the more the imagery shifts. Hands reaching toward each other, veils slipping, masks half pulled from faces. These are not the murals the Senate commissions for public baths. Here, the art is for an audience who understands every tilt of a head, every flourish of a robe. The air changes, warmer, heavier, scented faintly with myrrh. You emerge into a smaller chamber where only a few people recline, speaking in low voices. A man with a silver clasp on his toga gestures for a cup to be passed to you. You take it, feeling the cool bronze against your palm, and catch the gleam of a ring on his finger, an engraving of a theatre mask, half smiling, half frowning. He watches you over the rim of his own cup, the way a cat watches something that has wandered too close. This, you realize, is where the real Rome exists, not in the marble monuments, but in the private spaces where reputation, politics, and appetite are braided together. The city's power doesn't just live in the forum, it pulses here, under lamplight, between whispered bargains and shared cups of spiced wine. Somewhere in the distance, a temple bell chimes, marking the hour. The conversation pauses just long enough for everyone to listen, then resumes as though nothing had interrupted it. You feel the pull to linger, to see what promises this night might keep. But in Rome, curiosity is both a torch and a snare, and tonight you're carrying it deep into the shadows. You turn a corner and find yourself under a colonnade washed in pale moonlight, the marble columns catching the silver glow like frozen waves. The hum of the city softens here, replaced by the faint trickle of a courtyard fountain and the rustle of leaves from an olive tree planted long before you were born. At the far end, you see a modest doorway, no gilded arch, no heraldic crest, yet the warm light spilling from it seems to pull you closer. Inside, the air is rich with the scent of honeyed wine and burning incense, a mix so heady it makes you pause. The walls are painted with soft, almost dreamlike scenes of gardens, lovers, and gods. This is not the rowdy backroom of a tavern you crept through earlier. This is deliberate. This is ceremonial. Your eyes land on the small altar against the wall, draped in crimson cloth. Upon it stand figurines: Venus with her calm and knowing smile, and Priapus, carved from olive wood, his exaggerated form both sacred and scandalous. The mainstream historical fact is simple. Roman households often kept small shrines, and their devotion to deities like Venus and Priapus wasn't merely symbolic. People genuinely believed these gods could influence fertility, passion, and personal charm, and they sought their favor not just for marriage or childbirth, but for everyday romantic and physical pursuits. You watch as a matron in a white stola steps forward, holding a shallow bronze dish filled with rose petals and oil. She scatters the petals onto the altar while murmuring words you can barely catch, her tone somewhere between a prayer and a promise. A man beside her, perhaps her husband, perhaps not, offers a small clay jar of honey, setting it beside Priapus's feet. A quirky tidbit floats into your mind. Some Romans believed that rubbing a charm blessed before the statue of Priapus on your own body could grant irresistible allure for the night ahead. The superstition was so widespread that certain markets sold blessed olive oil in unmarked jars, whispered to have been poured at such shrines before being offered to customers who didn't dare admit why they wanted it. At the edge of the room, a young man in a deep blue tunic is sketching something on a wax tablet, glancing up every so often to capture a gesture, a smile, a turn of the head. You're reminded that historians still argue whether these household rites were primarily spiritual or whether they functioned more like elaborate social rituals, a way to dress private longing in the respectable clothes of religion. The people gathered here are not the city's poorest, nor its emperors. They're merchants, widows, freedmen, people who live between the extremes of power and poverty, but who still want to tip the scales of fortune in their favor. You see an older woman slip a sprig of myrtle into the pocket of a younger man's tunic. He touches it lightly, and they exchange the kind of glance that makes you sure it's more than a gesture of blessing. From somewhere outside, a breeze pushes in the faint sound of a flute. The melody is slow and winding, as if trying to wrap itself around the flickering lamplight. A serving girl moves through the room, refilling cups with golden wine. She offers one to you, her eyes glinting in the dim light. You take it, sipping, the sweetness lingering on your tongue like the last note of a song. There's a rhythm here: prayer, offering, wine, glance, touch that feels older than the city itself. You realize you're watching a performance in which everyone knows their part, yet nothing is scripted. It's a dance between faith and appetite, a delicate balancing act where the gods are as much audience as participants. You notice too how the figurines are positioned. Venus elevated slightly above Priapus, her serene gaze looking down on his irreverent grin. The arrangement seems intentional, a reminder that beauty and desire are siblings who never entirely agree on what's proper. As the evening deepens, more guests arrive. Some bring figs and almonds, others small loaves of bread dusted with sesame. These are laid on the altar, but you can see from the sideways glances that they won't all remain there. In Rome, offerings had a way of becoming part of the after-ritual feast. The matron returns to the altar, this time carrying a bowl of water perfumed with bay leaves. She dips her fingers and sprinkles the guests, murmuring a blessing for luck in matters of the heart. A few of the younger women giggle softly, dabbing the drops onto their necks as if applying perfume. You lean back against a cool column, the flicker of the oil lamps painting your shadow across the mosaic floor. Somewhere in the distance, you can almost hear the murmurs of other households performing the same rites, scattered across the vast city. Alone, each gathering is just a whisper. Together, they are the heartbeat of Rome's private nights. And tonight, you are listening to it closely enough to hear every subtle note. You follow the sound of laughter spilling from a street where the lamps seem brighter, the air warmer, as if the city itself is leaning in to watch. The cobblestones are scattered with petals, the doorways strung with garlands of ivy and vine leaves. A flute trills somewhere above you, and the scent of spiced wine drifts thick in the air. You've stumbled into a celebration that pulses with more than music. This is Bacchus's realm, and his followers waste no time in blurring the line between devotion and indulgence. The mainstream historical fact here is as intoxicating as the wine. The Bacchanalia, imported from Greek cult practice, was both a religious rite and a social event, honoring Bacchus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and transformation. In its earliest form, the rites were small and exclusive, but by the late Republic they had swelled into sprawling nighttime gatherings, enough to alarm the Senate into regulating them. And yet, you can see with your own eyes tonight that rules on parchment rarely still a beating heart or a cup in motion. Under a canopy of grapevines, the guests recline on cushions, their fingers stained purple from fresh grapes, and their cheeks flushed from strong wine. A priestess draped in a robe of deep green stands at the center, her hair crowned with ivy. She tilts her head back, pouring a stream of wine onto the earth in offering, and the crowd answers with a cheer. You catch sight of a man wearing a fox mask, his tunic slipping off one shoulder. He offers you a clay cup, and before you can refuse, he's filled it to the brim. The first sip burns, not from heat but from the infusion of cinnamon and honey. He leans closer, speaking over the music. For Bacchus, all boundaries dissolve. His breath smells faintly of figs, his words heavy with promise. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some accounts claim that during these festivals, the wine was sometimes mixed with hallucinogenic herbs to loosen the mind for divine messages. Whether true or just, a moralist smear campaign, the idea clings to the Bacchanalia like ivy to stone. You take another sip, wondering which version you're drinking. Around you, the dancing begins not the structured steps of the forum, but a wild, swaying rhythm where bodies move like branches in a storm. Some dancers are veiled, their identities hidden, others wear masks shaped like stags, owls, or serpents. You realize the anonymity is as much part of the rite as the wine, an invitation to step beyond yourself, if only for a night. Historians still argue whether these gatherings were truly orgiastic in the way ancient moralists described, or if later writers exaggerated them to justify the Senate's crackdowns. Standing here, you can see how easy it would be for an outsider to misread the chaos, to imagine more than what's visible. And yet, the glances exchanged, the hands brushing in the half-dark, they carry their own quiet stories. A group of musicians in the corner shifts the tempo. Drums join the flutes, their deep thud resonating in your chest. The priestess begins a chant, her voice low and deliberate, and the crowd answers each line with laughter, claps, or the tossing of more petals. You realize you've lost track of time, the moon seems higher than it was, and the wine in your cup keeps replenishing itself without you remembering to ask. A masked dancer brushes past you, pressing something small into your palm. You glance down to see a grape leaf folded around a fig. Inside, you find a scrap of parchment with a single word written in red ink. You can't read it in the dim light, and by the time you look up, the dancer has vanished into the moving crowd. The space grows warmer, the air thick with perfume and the scent of crushed fruit underfoot. You step back toward the edge of the gathering, feeling the music pull at you even as you try to steady your thoughts. In the flickering lamplight, the ivy shadows seem to shift on the walls, twisting into shapes that almost look like faces. You're aware of your heartbeat now, matching the drum beats, each thud blurring the line between your body and the rhythm of the room. It's intoxicating, yes, but also something else. There's a weight beneath the joy here, a sense that everyone is running from something as much as toward it. Somewhere beyond the music, the city still ticks on the watchman's rounds, the clatter of late-night carts, but here, you're outside of that time. You're in Bacchus's hour, where the rules bend, and the world feels just a little less certain. And as the priestess raises her arms for the next offering, you feel the tug to step deeper into the circle, into the heart of the revel. After all, in Rome, the night has a way of deciding who you'll be by dawn. You slip away from Bacchus's thrumming revels with your ears still ringing and your mind buzzing, only to find yourself drifting into a quieter quarter of the city. Here the streets are broader, the paving stones cleaner, and the doorways framed with marble. Torches burn in silver sconces rather than smoky iron brackets, casting a steady, elegant glow. The laughter here is softer, the kind of sound that doesn't want the whole city to know. Ahead, you spot a palatial townhouse with its main entrance closed, but a side gate standing ajar. Two men in crisp tunics stand nearby, their eyes scanning the street, not for threats, but for invitations. You pass between them, feeling the weight of their gaze as the gate closes behind you with a discreet click. The courtyard beyond is set with columns draped in silk and roses. The air smells faintly of sandalwood, and from somewhere inside you hear the muted notes of a lyre. Servants move like shadows, their sandaled feet silent on the mosaic floor. You recognize the subtle trappings of wealth, but also the calculated effort to appear effortless. This is the domain of Rome's political elite, where the masks are as important as the faces beneath them. A mainstream historical fact slides into place. Among the senatorial and equestrian classes, private banquets and masked gatherings weren't simply leisure, they were instruments of influence. Behind closed doors, alliances were brokered, rivals flattered into submission, and favors traded with the same quiet efficiency as silver coin. These events were as much about who you were seen with as what you did there. Tonight the masks are literal. Guests arrive wearing half masks of gold, ivory, or lacquered wood. A woman in a crimson pallor glides past you, her mask shaped like a dove. Behind her, a man in deep green wears a lion's snarl, the gold catching the lamplight as he tilts his head toward her. Conversations drift past in fragments, half promises, half teases. No one here admits to recognizing anyone else, but everyone does. A quirky tidbit whispers from memory. Some masks at these gatherings were scented on the inside with pressed herbs or flower oils, a private indulgence meant only for the wearer. It was said that the more exotic the scent, the more exotic the wearer's tastes. You wonder what stories could be told by the bouquet of lavender, myrrh, and something sharper that reaches your nose as a masked man brushes past. Historians still argue whether such masquerades served as mere amusement, or whether they were a strategic cover for conduct that would have been scandalous in daylight. The truth may lie somewhere between pleasure and politics, rarely kept separate rooms in Rome. You're guided into a triclinium, where couches are arranged in a loose crescent around a low table piled with figs, almonds, and small silver dishes of candied ginger. Wine is poured into crystal cups, and the first toasts begin ostensibly to the health of the Republic. But you hear the sly undercurrent in the toasting. To long nights, says one, and longer alliances, says another, earning knowing chuckles. Across the room, a senator you recognize from the forum gestures toward a corner curtained in peacock blue silk. You watch as two guests slip behind it, their masks catching the light for just an instant before vanishing. The murmur of conversation fades slightly in that direction, replaced by the softer sound of fabric moving. The host, an older man with a gold laurel pin at his shoulder, approaches you, his mask plain but his eyes sharp. He asks in a voice as smooth as the wine, "Are you enjoying the anonymity?" Before you can answer, he's already moved on to greet another guest, leaving you with the faint impression you've just passed an unspoken test. The music shifts, slower now, the lyre joined by the hollow pulse of a hand drum. Guests rise from their couches to mingle more freely, the space filling with low conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. The masks seem to embolden some, allowing them to stand closer, speak softer, linger longer in each other's presence. You find yourself near the silk-curtained corner again. A servant passes by carrying a tray of pomegranate seeds in a shallow silver dish. You take a few, the tart sweetness waking your tongue as the fabric stirs just enough for you to glimpse a sliver of shadowed movement inside. Someone laughs softly, and the curtain falls still. In the far corner, an ivory-masked woman stands alone, her gaze fixed on the garden beyond the open colonnade. You follow her line of sight to the moonlit fountain outside, its water catching the glow from within the house. For a moment, it's as if the whole gathering exists in a fragile bubble, suspended between the garden's stillness and the political storm beyond the walls. Here, the masks are both shield and key, concealing the self from the crowd, while unlocking conversations that might shape the course of a career. And as the evening deepens, you sense that some masks may stay on even after the guests return to the daylight streets. The streets grow narrower again as you wander away from the senatorial quarter, the marble façades giving way to plaster walls streaked with rainwater and the faint smell of wood smoke. You pass under a low arch where ivy dangles in heavy ropes, and beyond it lies a small courtyard glowing with lamplight. The light comes not from tall sconces or ornate braziers, but from squat clay lamps lined along a wall, each one casting a soft amber pool around a mural that stops you in your tracks. The wall is alive with painted scenes, gardens, fruit, and most strikingly a figure with an exaggerated smile and well, everything. His name comes to you instantly, Priapus. In these paintings he stands amid grapevines or leans against olive trees, a basket of fruit slung casually at his hip. You can't help noticing the part of him no painter ever minimized. A mainstream historical fact takes shape. Priapus was both a rural fertility god and a kind of divine prankster, his image painted or carved in gardens and doorways as both a blessing and a warning. Farmers prayed to him for abundant harvests, and homeowners trusted his famously threatening verses to deter thieves, verses promising thieves far more than arrest if they were caught. As you study the mural, a voice behind you says, "He watches over the market." You turn to see a woman balancing a tray of figs and dates. She wears a faded green stola and a necklace of carved bone beads. And sometimes, she adds with a grin, he watches over the bedroom. She gestures for you to follow her through a narrow doorway into a room perfumed with rosemary and wine. Here, several smaller statues of Priapus stand on shelves, each carved from olive wood, each grinning as if they know something you don't. A small crowd gathers, their hands occupied with wine cups or small offerings, a loaf of bread here, a sprig of bay leaves there. A quirky tidbit flickers to mind. Some Roman households kept miniature Priapus figurines inside their homes, believing they could ward off jealousy or bad luck in love. It's said that in certain circles gifting one of these statues was less a blessing and more a very pointed invitation. The woman with the tray offers you a fig, its skin split to reveal the crimson flesh inside. As you bite into it, she explains that the local traders hold a small ceremony to Priapus before the busiest market days. It's half tradition, half superstition, pouring wine over the god's feet, scattering rose petals, and making quietly personal requests that range from good sales to good company. Historians still argue whether Priapus was ever taken seriously as a religious figure or whether his worship was always tinged with humor. Standing here, you suspect the truth is both. The laughter doesn't make the prayers less sincere. The room hums with conversation as the wine flows, and every so often someone touches one of the statues as they pass. You notice one particularly worn from years of hands brushing over it, the wood polished smooth. A man with a silver ring shaped like a vine leaf catches you looking and winks, as if you've just stumbled into the punchline of a joke centuries in the making. From outside, you hear the clatter of a cart and the muffled calls of vendors packing up for the night. But inside this room, the pace is slower, the talk warmer, and the air thick with a sense of shared mischief. When you step back into the courtyard, the mural catches the lamplight in a way that makes Priapus's painted eyes seem to follow you. You're not sure if it's a blessing, a warning, or simply good art, but you walk away feeling as though you've just been added to the long list of people this god has quietly seen. The night air cools as you cross a stone bridge, the river beneath reflecting lantern light in broken, shivering strips. On the far bank, the streets are quieter, but there's a certain expectancy in the way a few lone figures lean in shadowed doorways. You pass between them, following the faint glow of a brazier ahead until you emerge into a courtyard surrounded by high walls. A servant opens the gate just enough for you to slip in, and the sound hits you first laughter, the splash of water, and the low murmur of voices blending with the hiss of steam. You've entered one of Rome's famed thermae, though this section isn't for the midday crowd of merchants and retirees. The polished marble benches, soft lamplight, and discreet attendants make it clear. This is where the baths double as meeting places for arrangements far beyond the practical business of getting clean. One widely recorded detail from the period is that public baths were a cornerstone of Roman daily life, serving as social hubs as much as places of hygiene. They were where news spread faster than in the forum, where deals were struck, and where the boundary between public respectability and private indulgence grew wonderfully thin. The caldarium here is warm enough to wrap your skin in heat the moment you enter. Steam hangs in the air like a curtain, softening the outlines of the room until only gleaming shoulders and lazy gestures remain. An attendant offers you a shallow bronze cup of watered wine. You accept, sipping as you watch two men speaking in the corner, their conversation low but their eyes glancing often toward the doorway. One curious side note is that some bathhouses were rumored to employ bath guides, individuals whose role went beyond fetching oil and towels, instead steering clients toward particular pools or introducing them to certain friends. Whether these guides were paid in coin, favors, or both, was a question few patrons bothered to ask. You wander toward the tepidarium, where the water laps quietly against the edges of the pool. A woman sits on the steps, letting her hair drift in the water while speaking to a merchant whose robe is folded neatly beside him. Their heads lean close enough to touch, their voices swallowed by the sound of rippling water. The scene is intimate without being overt, like a dance whose steps everyone here already knows. Scholarly opinion remains divided on whether such late-night gatherings were tolerated by the authorities out of pragmatism or sheer indifference. Some sources insist they were frowned upon, while others suggest that as long as no one caused public scandal, the baths were left to their own devices. You dip your fingers into the warm pool, the water carrying the scent of rose oil. Nearby, an attendant kneels to refill a jar from a copper basin, moving with the deliberate slowness of someone who knows they are being watched. And indeed, a man reclining against the far wall watches him closely, his smile small but deliberate. As you move toward the frigidarium, the chill air wraps around you like a challenge. The cold pool gleams under lamplight, empty except for a single figure, an older man whose gold armlet glints with each movement. He catches your gaze for a moment, then looks away, as though to remind you that nothing here is truly an accident. The baths have their own language, a tilt of the head, a pause before stepping into the water, a lingering hand when offering a cup of wine. It's a lexicon you've only begun to understand, but tonight it speaks clearly enough. By the time you step back into the courtyard, the stars overhead seem sharper, the air cooler. Behind you, the steam still curls upward, carrying with it 100 whispered conversations you'll never fully hear, but you know their echoes will follow you deeper into the city's night. You leave the baths with the warmth still clinging to your skin, the night air sharpening your senses. The streets tilt upward here, climbing toward the Palatine Hill, and you follow the faint glow of oil lamps set in carved niches. The houses are larger, their doorways framed in marble, and guarded by bronze doors that gleam even in the low light. Somewhere above you, the faint sound of a stringed instrument drifts through the still air, punctuated by soft laughter. The scent of perfume, jasmine, myrrh. Something sharper guides you toward a villa whose entrance is guarded not by soldiers, but by two young men in matching deep blue tunics. They glance at each other before stepping aside to let you in. The atrium opens into a long hall lined with frescoes of gardens and pavilions, but it's the figures within the painted scenes that catch your attention, graceful women reclining, their hands mid-gesture, eyes forever fixed on some unseen guest. A well-attested feature of Roman high society was the role of the meretrix honesta courtesans, whose clientele included senators, generals, and wealthy merchants. Far from the backstreet brothel, these women operated in spheres where conversation, poetry, and influence were as important as physical beauty. Some even became confidantes or informal advisors to their patrons, their status both envied and resented. At the far end of the hall, a curtain of fine linen parts to reveal a triclinium draped in silks. Low tables are set with dishes of olives, figs, and almonds dusted with cinnamon. Reclining among the cushions are women whose attire alone marks their profession. Dresses of imported silk, hair adorned with gold pins shaped like dolphins or serpents, each detail a calculated signal to the guests. An offbeat anecdote from the era tells us that certain courtesans commissioned perfumes blended uniquely for them, scents so distinctive that patrons claimed they could recognize a woman's arrival without seeing her, simply by the air shifting in the room. As you move deeper inside, you catch a trace of sandalwood and rose oil mingled, and you can't help but wonder whose signature that might be tonight. In the corner, a woman with hair the color of polished bronze recites a few lines of Ovid, her voice low but perfectly measured. The men around her listen as though every syllable is a gift. You realize this isn't just entertainment, it's negotiation, the weaving of reputation as skillfully as any tapestry. Experts remain at odds over whether such gatherings blurred into political salons or stayed firmly in the realm of private indulgence. The truth, judging by the guarded yet knowing smiles around you, may be that they were both, depending on the company and the hour. A servant offers you a cup of dark wine sweetened with honey, and you accept, letting its warmth slide down your throat. Across the room, a courtesan in a deep green stola tilts her head at you, a silent invitation to join her circle. You hesitate, and in that pause, another guest, a merchant with rings on every finger, moves to take your place. She welcomes him with a smile that reveals nothing but intention. As the night lengthens, the triclinium hums with a rhythm of conversation, laughter, and the occasional burst of applause at a clever verse. Deals are hinted at, secrets exchanged, but all under the protective layer of elegance and wit. When you finally step back out into the night, the air feels different, cooler, quieter, yet charged with the lingering sense that you've just walked through a place where Rome's pleasures and its politics meet in silk-lined secrecy. The climb away from the Palatine takes you toward the clang of distant metal and the faint smell of wood smoke. You pass a small shrine to Mercury, its offerings of coins and garlands glinting in the lamplight, before the street widens into an open space near the old military road. Here, the sound of laughter mingles with the rhythmic thud of boots on hard ground. Rows of tents stretch across the field beyond the city wall, their flaps drawn back to reveal flickers of firelight inside. This isn't the parade ground, nor is it a formal encampment. It's the loosely ordered, half-hidden sprawl of a castra when the night is theirs to keep. Contemporary accounts consistently note that Roman military camps were not monastic fortresses of discipline once the sun went down. While the army maintained strict codes, the presence of unofficial companions, camp followers, was a fact of life. These included traders, entertainers, and those whose profession was less openly named, all moving in a fragile orbit around the soldiers' lives. You weave between the tents, catching glimpses of men in various states of relaxation. One sharpening a sword, while another hums an old marching song, a pair rolling dice on a low stool, a few more gathered around a pot of stew thick with lentils. But there are other shapes in the firelight, women in wool cloaks lined with fur, a boy with a drum, even a man leading a tethered goat for reasons you'd rather not guess. A lesser-known but colourful detail from this world is that some veterans brought their families along on campaigns despite regulations forbidding it. In peacetime encampments, wives and children might live just beyond the official boundaries, blurring the line between the army's public image and its private reality. Near a fire pit, a soldier offers you a cup of watered wine. His helmet sits upside down beside him, filled with pomegranate seeds and dried figs. "Better than what the quartermaster gives us," he says, grinning. A woman at his side adds, "And bought with my coin, not the emperor's." Her voice carries both pride and challenge. The question continues to spark disagreement among researchers. Were these nighttime gatherings tolerated because they kept the troops content, or were they an unavoidable failure of enforcement? Standing here, you can see the logic in both views. Morale is a currency all its own, and no commander ignores its value for long. Further along, the music grows louder. A man in a striped tunic dances on the packed earth, while two others beat time on upturned shields. The crowd cheers him on, coins flashing briefly in the firelight as wagers change hands. In the shadows behind them, quieter exchanges happen, hushed conversations, the passing of small parcels, a quick clasp of hands before parting. You pause near the edge of the encampment, where the lamplight thins and the city's glow fades into the dark. A lone figure stands there, looking out toward the hills. His spear is planted in the earth, but his shoulders are relaxed. When he turns, the smile he gives you is more tired than inviting. Not everyone here is chasing the night. Some are just letting it pass. The wind shifts, carrying with it the mixed scents of firewood, leather, sweat, and roasted meat. Somewhere behind you, laughter rises again, pulling you back toward the heart of the encampment. And as you walk, you realize the same truth you've been finding all over Rome. Whether in marble halls or canvas tents, the night is a stage, and everyone here knows their part. The music from the camp fades behind you, replaced by the uneven rhythm of your own footsteps over cobblestones slick with dew. A faint breeze carries the smell of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor's brazier, but another scent quickly overtakes it, thick, exotic, and sweet, like cinnamon and smoke wrapped together. You follow it into a district where the buildings huddle close, their upper stories leaning toward each other as though sharing whispered gossip above the street. A line of lanterns marks the entrance to a small square. Here, merchants from every corner of the empire gather after sunset, their stalls draped in bright fabrics, trays of glinting trinkets, and bowls piled with strange fruits. But it's the stage in the middle that draws the crowd low and wide, scattered with silk scarves, metal cymbals, and a few earthen jars of wine already half emptied. From the far side, you hear the sharp snap of a drum, and a figure steps into the circle of torchlight. Her tunic is cut shorter than Roman modesty allows, her bare arms traced with painted patterns in blue and gold. The crowd leans in as she begins to move, each step fluid, hips swaying in time with the beat. Her hair, black as volcanic glass, is strung with beads that clatter softly when she spins. Ancient sources often mention that the capital drew entertainers from as far as Syria, Egypt, and beyond. These dancers were more than curiosities. They brought the allure of distant lands into the heart of Rome, offering not just a performance but a taste of somewhere far away, somewhere imagined. Near the front, a young man offers the dancer a small coin. She takes it without breaking her rhythm, tucking it into the fold of her belt. In return, she spins so close that her perfume, sharp, smoky, and unfamiliar, spills over him. His face flushes in the torchlight, though whether from heat or something else is hard to tell. One curious side note buried in a few dusty commentaries is that certain entertainers were said to speak in half-coded language while they danced, gestures, glances, and movements that meant different things depending on the watcher's understanding. For the uninitiated, it was simply art. For those in the know, it was an invitation or a refusal, as clear as speech. A boy no older than 12 weaves through the crowd, balancing a tray of cups filled with dark red wine. He pauses beside you, and when you reach for a cup, he whispers, "Don't drink it all at once." His eyes dart toward the stage, as though the advice is connected to more than just manners. The drum beat changes, slower now, more deliberate. 2 more dancers join the first, their costumes different, one in a long skirt of gold-threaded cloth, the other in loose trousers of emerald silk. The 3 move together, weaving in and out like strands of rope, the shapes they form at once playful and calculated. You notice a few audience members slipping away toward the narrow alleys at the square's edge, their departure as unremarked as it is purposeful. Scholarly opinion remains divided on whether these gatherings were purely entertainment or whether they served as discreet fronts for other transactions. You watch a merchant in a striped cloak lean to whisper in the ear of the emerald-trousered dancer during a pause in her steps. She laughs, not the bright, public laugh of the performance, but something smaller, private, and disappears with him into the alley. The music quickens again, pulling the crowd's attention back to the stage. The lead dancer now holds a small clay jar, pouring a thin stream of fragrant oil into her palm and letting it trail down her arm as she moves. The scent catches you even from a distance, spicy, rich, impossible to place. A man beside you mutters, "That's worth more than half this crowd earns in a month." Whether he means the oil or the woman using it, you can't be sure. An older woman in the audience claps along, her bracelets jingling in counterpoint to the drum. She catches you looking and says with a grin, "First time?" You nod, and she leans closer. Then remember, never believe the performance ends when the music stops. She turns back to the stage, leaving you with the uneasy sense that the night here has layers you can't yet see. The final song ends in a flurry of motion, spinning skirts, tossed scarves, the deep roll of the drum echoing off the walls of the square. Coins rain onto the stage, flashing briefly in the torchlight before vanishing into the dancers' quick hands. The crowd begins to thin, some heading toward the wine stalls, others melting into the network of side streets. You linger, watching as the lead dancer gathers her scarves into a bundle. She glances up, and for the briefest moment, her gaze catches yours. Not the sweeping look of a performer, but something sharper, appraising. Then she turns away, vanishing into the same alley where the merchant disappeared earlier. The square grows quieter, the torches sputtering as their oil burns low. Somewhere in the distance, the river laps against the embankment, and the faint sound of a flute carries through the night air. You realize your pulse is still matching the rhythm of the drums, as though part of you is reluctant to leave the circle of torchlight behind. In Rome, you think, even the smallest stage can hold the entire city's secrets if you know how to watch. The alleyways spill you back toward the heart of the city, where the night smells of trampled flowers and overturned wine cups. Lanterns hang from poles strung across the street, their yellow light trembling with every breeze. Somewhere ahead, a roar of voices swells and breaks like a wave. You follow it, the sound pulling you through the crowd until you emerge into a plaza alive with noise, color, and smoke. Tall poles draped in ribbons mark the perimeter of the gathering. Within them, a half-dozen low stages have been set up, each with its own performance. At one, an acrobat balances on the shoulders of 2 companions while juggling clay jars. At another, a man in a peacock, feather headdress sings in a language you don't recognize. But it's the stage at the far end, under the largest awning, that holds the tightest knot of people. When you edge closer, you see why. A troupe of entertainers from the eastern provinces has taken over the platform. Their clothes shimmer under the lamplight sashes of turquoise and gold, skirts that flare with every turn, bare feet moving in a rhythm older than the empire itself. They don't just dance, they tell stories with each gesture. A hand to the heart, a finger to the lips, a slow spin with the head tilted just so every movement is a word in a language made of motion. Writers of the time noted that such performers were often prized not only for their skill, but for the air of mystery they carried. To Roman audiences, the accent, the costume, the foreign style of movement all hinted at worlds beyond the city's borders, places filled with customs and freedoms that seemed at once dangerous and intoxicating. A man in the crowd passes a clay cup to his neighbor, murmuring something you can't catch. The neighbor laughs and tilts the cup toward the stage in a kind of toast. It's then you notice that the dancers are not looking over the audience's heads. As most performers do, they are making deliberate eye contact with individuals, pausing their steps just long enough to let the gaze linger. One lesser-known account from a poet's private letters describes these exchanges as an unspoken auction. The most promising patrons were marked with a glance or a smile, and after the performance, the path to the meeting place was simply found by both parties. Watching now, you can almost see that invisible thread weaving through the crowd. The lead performer, a woman with a cascade of black curls threaded with gold rings, pauses mid-spin to adjust the sash at her waist. It's a small motion, but the crowd reacts with a murmur as if she's spoken aloud. Her eyes sweep the front row and stop briefly on you before moving on. The touch of her gaze feels oddly tangible, like a fingertip brushing the back of your neck. Academic discussion on this point is far from settled. Were these glances calculated parts of the act, or genuine sparks caught in the moment? The sources are maddeningly vague, perhaps because those who experienced it firsthand preferred not to explain it away. The music builds towards its end, drums deepening, flutes rising in a spiraling melody that seems to tug at your chest. The dancers quicken their pace, skirts and sashes a blur of color, until the final beat lands and they freeze in perfect stillness. The crowd bursts into applause, coins clinking as they're tossed toward the stage. You watch as the performers bow and retreat behind the awning. The crowd begins to disperse, but you notice a few men and women lingering at the edges, speaking to attendants who nod toward the curtained rear of the stage. Soon, those chosen slip away into the narrow lanes behind the plaza. One of the attendants catches your eye. He doesn't beckon exactly, but his chin tilts in a way that suggests you could follow if you wanted. You stay where you are, unsure whether your hesitation is caution or curiosity. From somewhere to your left, a gust of laughter rises. A group of youths wearing brightly painted masks dash past, scattering petals in their wake. The plaza is beginning to empty, the ribboned poles swaying gently in the night breeze. You turn toward the main road, but the image of the lead dancer's gaze follows you, as persistent as the echo of the drums in your ears. You have the sense that Rome has countless such moments tucked away in its streets, brief intersections where chance and design meet, leaving behind a trace you can't quite shake. As you walk on, the city seems quieter, but you know it's only because you've stepped away from one performance and toward another. In this place, the night is never empty, it simply changes its mask. You drift away from the plaza and follow the distant hum of a crowd that sounds different from the cheers of a performance, lower, almost reverent, like a tide moving in and out. The streets grow busier again, but not with merchants or tavern-goers. Families, couples, and groups of friends stream in the same direction, carrying bunches of flowers, garlands of leaves, and small clay lamps. You join them, curious, and soon the glow of hundreds of flames comes into view. At the center of a wide square stands a towering wooden arch dressed in fresh greenery. Beneath it, priests in white robes move between tables piled with bread, wine, and baskets of fruit. The air is heavy with the scent of crushed roses underfoot, mingling with the sharper smell of resin burning on a brazier. This is no small gathering, it's one of the Venusian festivals, a celebration dedicated to the goddess of love, beauty, and fortune. Records from the period make clear that these festivals were a strange blend of piety and play. On the surface, they honored Venus with public rituals and processions. Beneath that, they provided an excuse for mingling with a freedom not usually found in the strict lanes of daily Roman life. For a day or night, the usual boundaries softened, and people spoke to strangers without apology. A priestess takes her place at the foot of the arch, raising a golden bowl in both hands. The crowd quiets as she pours wine onto the earth, her voice carrying over the hush. It's not Latin she speaks, but something older, her words winding like a slow river. You feel the shift in the air, not solemn exactly, but weighted, as if the city is holding its breath. A lesser-known detail that survives in a few personal letters is that participants sometimes wrote their wishes for love or fortune on strips of papyrus, folding them into garlands that were later burned in Venus's honor. You notice a cluster of young women tying such strips into the greenery around the arch, their faces lit with anticipation and a little mischief. When the chanting ends, music bursts into the square flutes, drums, and the plucking of a kithara. The mood changes instantly, the crowd spilling into the open space between the arch and the tables. Couples dance, children chase each other around the pillars, and vendors appear with trays of honey cakes and spiced wine. An older man with a wreath of ivy offers you a cup. "For Venus," he says, his eyes bright with drink. The wine is sweet, warming your throat as he leans in. "She likes it when we remember she's not just a statue." His laughter mingles with the music before he's swept away into the crowd. Some historians suggest that the more playful customs of the Venusian festival's flirtations, exchanged gifts, stolen kisses were tolerated because they served as a release valve for the city's otherwise rigid moral codes. Watching a young soldier offer a flower to a woman twice his age and seeing her accept it with a wink, you can believe it. In one corner of the square, a group of dancers forms a ring, drawing in anyone who hesitates too close. You find yourself pulled in, moving awkwardly at first, then matching the simple steps as the circle spins faster. The air smells of crushed herbs, warm bodies, and the faint metallic tang of the brazier's smoke. The rhythm is easy, hypnotic, until you forget you came here as an observer. At the edge of the crowd, a line of women in crimson sashes pass small bundles of myrtle and rosemary to anyone who reaches for them. A boy of about 10 shoves one into your hand before darting off, leaving you with the sharp scent of the leaves filling your palm. The music slows, the circle loosens, and people drift back to the food tables. Overhead, the stars have shifted, and you realize hours have passed without notice. The priestess reappears, this time scattering rose petals into the crowd. One lands on your shoulder, its edges damp from the night air. The festival will continue until dawn, but you feel the pull of the quieter streets beyond. As you walk away, the music follows you for a while, fading only when the narrow lanes close in again. You glance back once to see the arch still glowing with lamps, the figures moving beneath it blurred by distance and flickering light. Rome, you think, knows how to wrap devotion in celebration until the two are impossible to tell apart. And perhaps that is its greatest skill, making even the sacred feel alive in the night. The streets beyond the festival seem quieter, but there's a different kind of tension here, one that settles in your chest like the air before a storm. You pass a row of shuttered shops and come to a villa whose high walls and guarded gate mark it as belonging to someone who needs both privacy and power. The guards don't stop you. They simply note your presence with eyes that miss nothing. Inside, the air smells faintly of cedar and lamp oil. The atrium is dim except for the glow of a single bronze lamp shaped like an eagle. Servants move in near silence, their heads bowed, guiding you toward a corridor that twists deeper into the house. The walls here are painted with mythological scenes, not the familiar gods in triumph, but stranger tales. Lovers turned to trees, hunters punished by the very prey they pursued. The corridor opens into a room bathed in soft gold light from dozens of small lamps. Cushions spill across the floor, and low tables hold silver dishes of figs, pomegranates, and roasted almonds. At the center of it all sits a man in a simple white tunic, but the gold seal ring on his finger and the way others defer to him leave. No doubt you're in the private domain of someone whose name bends laws. Writings from the era make no secret that emperors and high officials often maintained hidden chambers for gatherings beyond the public eye. These were places where conversation could be frank, pleasures pursued without scrutiny, and alliances shaped in whispers rather than decrees. A woman in a pale blue stola enters, carrying a shallow bowl of water, steam curling from its surface. She kneels before the man, washing his hands with a care that feels ceremonial. His gaze drifts across the room and lands briefly on you, calm, measuring, almost amused. Without speaking, he gestures for you to join the semicircle of guests reclining nearby. One intriguing record from a household steward's journal describes how such evenings often blended entertainment with subtle political theatre. A singer's ballad might contain a veiled barb at a rival, or a game played with dice might decide the outcome of a small but profitable contract. You watch as a slender man with sharp eyes pours wine for the host, whispering something that makes the older man laugh under his breath. A poet begins reciting verses soft, languid, each line rolling into the next like warm honey. Between the words, servants move through the room, offering dishes of honey-soaked dates and cups of spiced wine. A guest to your right murmurs a toast, to the emperor's health, though you suspect the name on his lips is less important than the alliances in this room. Experts remain at odds over how much of what happened in these gatherings was genuine indulgence and how much was calculated display. Judging by the measured pace of conversation and the glances traded between certain guests, it's possible no one here truly relaxes, even in silk and lamplight. The host rises, crossing the room to where a small lyre rests against the wall. He plucks a few strings, the notes soft and deliberate. The conversation quiets as the melody unfolds, an old song, you're told later, known only among a handful of the city's elite. You realize you're witnessing something that will never be mentioned outside these walls. When the music ends, the host claps once, and servants draw back a curtain at the far side of the room. Beyond it lies a smaller space, even more richly lit, where the scent of burning myrrh drifts in thick waves. Several guests rise and slip inside, their movements unhurried but purposeful. You stay where you are, watching as the curtain falls back into place. The host catches your eye again, his expression unreadable. Then he returns to his seat, lifting his cup in a gesture that feels both like welcome and warning. Later, as you step back into the cool night air, you realize you've been holding your breath. The villa's walls rise behind you, sealing in whatever else this evening holds, and Rome's streets open ahead, ready to swallow you back into their restless flow. The moon hangs high over the rooftops as you wind your way toward a quieter district, where the hum of street life fades into the hush of guarded spaces. Marble columns rise from the shadows ahead, framing a courtyard lit by oil lamps placed in precise symmetry. The place smells faintly of laurel leaves and cool stone, a stark contrast to the perfume and spice lingering in your memory from earlier. At the center of the courtyard stands the domed Temple of Vesta, its circular form seeming to contain the night itself. You hesitate on the threshold, aware of the sanctity of this place. The Vestal Virgins live here, Rome's priestesses of the hearth, bound to 30 years of service and an unbroken vow of chastity. Even emperors are said to approach them with a careful blend of respect and fear. Surviving records tell us the Vestal's role was far more than ceremonial. They tended the sacred fire that symbolized the life of the city, oversaw important wills and state documents, and acted as symbols of Rome's moral purity. But that purity was not invulnerable. Rumors of scandal carried more weight here than in any other corner of the empire. A quiet movement catches your eye. In the colonnade, two women in the white stola of the Vestals speak in low tones, their faces turned slightly away from the lamplight. One gestures subtly toward the gate, the other shakes her head but smiles an expression that would be harmless anywhere else, yet here feels almost transgressive. An unusual note in one court record mentions that accusations against a Vestal, whether founded or fabricated, could lead to trials that captivated all of Rome. Acquittal brought relief to the city. Conviction meant burial alive, a punishment so severe that even hardened senators reportedly looked away. You wonder if the women before you are simply sharing a private joke or treading a line so fine that history might have noticed. From somewhere inside the temple, a faint chime sounds soft, like a bronze bell tapped with a fingertip. The two women step apart instantly, their faces returning to the composed stillness expected of their station. A third Vestal emerges from the shadows, carrying a basket of offerings. Her eyes pass over you briefly, without curiosity or warmth, as if you are part of the architecture. Some scholars believe the whispered stories about the Vestal's secret liaisons were political weapons, used to undermine factions by association. Others think the cloistered life, combined with the Vestal's high status, made such rumors inevitable. The truth, like the women themselves, stays hidden behind walls and ritual. You follow the curve of the colonnade, the stone cool beneath your fingertips. Inside the open doorway of the temple, the sacred fire burns low, its flames steady but subdued. The air is warmer here, touched with the scent of oak smoke. You stand for a moment, watching the slow dance of the firelight, and think about how this small, contained blaze is tied to the fate of the entire city. A voice, clear and even, speaks from somewhere behind you. Visitors are welcome until the lamps are extinguished. You turn to see a Vestal standing in the doorway, her face calm, her tone revealing nothing. You nod, step back, and she closes the doors with emotion as measured as her words. The courtyard feels cooler when you leave, the lamps casting long shadows across the marble. The city beyond the gate seems louder now, almost coarse after the temple's restrained silence. You glance back once to see the columns still standing tall against the night, guardians of a fire you will never touch but will always remember. The road from the Vestal courtyard leads you into a livelier quarter, where the air feels looser, the conversation freer. The streets open into a semicircular plaza, dominated by the curved facade of a theatre, its marble pillars rising in neat rhythm toward the night sky. Torches in iron baskets throw long shadows across the crowd waiting at the entrance. You slip inside with them, the scent of oil lamps and worn wood replacing the crisp air of the street. The seating rises in steep tiers, packed with citizens wrapped in cloaks against the evening chill. On the stage below, a pair of actors in brightly painted masks are already mid-dialogue, their voices carrying effortlessly even to the back rows. At first the play seems harmless, a fable about a merchant and his clever wife, but the lines slide quickly into a different tone. A pause after a suggestive phrase, a wink toward the audience, a gesture that lingers a breath too long. Laughter rolls through the seats like a wave. Roman writers often remarked that the theatre was one of the safest places to smuggle scandal into public discourse. On stage, moral censors might allow what they would ban in the forum, so long as it came wrapped in comedy. A well-crafted joke could hint at forbidden desires, political jabs, or even poke at the private habits of the powerful, all while the actors claimed it was just a story. Halfway through the performance, the merchant's wife, played by a man in a woman's costume, enters carrying a basket of figs. She sets them downstage and proceeds to describe each one in terms that draw howls from the crowd. A vendor moving through the stands nearly trips from laughing so hard he has to clutch his tray. One particularly sharp-eyed critic from antiquity claimed that certain troupes specialized in this kind of layered performance where the official plot was family-friendly, but an unspoken shadow script unfolded in the gestures and timing. Watching now, you can believe it. The actors exchange quick glances, their masks hiding smiles that seem meant for each other more than for the audience. The scene changes, and a group of musicians takes the stage. Their song appears to praise the virtues of a Roman matron, but the lyrics twist just enough to suggest they might be speaking of someone else entirely. Someone in the audience, perhaps. Heads turn, whispers spread, and you notice a man in the front row pull his cloak a little tighter. Some historians still wonder whether these plays ever crossed the line into outright scandal, or whether they thrived precisely because they danced on the edge without stepping over. Here in the warm glow of the lamps, the audience seems happy to live in that tension, laughing a little louder than the lines strictly require. As the final act unfolds, the merchant delivers a closing monologue that on the surface laments the price of grain, but in its rhythm and inflection carries an entirely different complaint about the cost of passion and the bargains struck in private. The crowd cheers as the actors bow, their masks bobbing in unison, and coins clatter onto the stage. Outside, the night air feels cooler after the warmth of the theatre. A few audience members linger under the colonnade, replaying their favorite lines in hushed tones. Someone near you mutters, "They'll never stage that one for the magistrates," and laughs to himself before melting into the crowd. You walk away with the echo of the actors' voices still in your ears, aware that Rome's stages are not just for entertainment, they're for saying the things that can't be said anywhere else, at least not without a mask. You follow the gentle slope of the street downhill, away from the theatre's laughter, into a district where the glow of shop fronts is replaced by the softer flicker of lamps in private doorways. The paving stones here are uneven, and every so often you pass a fountain trickling into a shallow basin where stray dogs lap quietly. The air smells of damp stone and something faintly sweet fresh papyrus, ink, and warm beeswax. The source becomes clear as you turn into a narrow lane, lined with small bookshops and scribes' stalls. Tonight, one of the shops is still open, its door propped wide to let the warm lamplight spill onto the street. Inside, the shelves are stacked not just with works of Cicero or Virgil, but with smaller, thinner scrolls bound in dyed leather, their titles handwritten in curling script. Contemporary accounts suggest that Roman poetry, especially the epigram, often doubled as a vehicle for desire, sometimes tender, sometimes sly, sometimes scandalous enough to circulate only in trusted circles. The name of Martial comes to mind, a master of verse whose lines could praise, mock, or seduce in the space of a dozen words. At a low table, a young man in an ink-stained tunic is carefully copying a short poem onto fresh parchment. He looks up and says, "For the festival next week, commissioned by someone who wants to make an impression." His tone leaves no doubt that the impression will not be entirely innocent. A lesser-known but telling practice was the exchange of such verses as part of courtship slipped into a fruit basket, rolled into a wax-sealed tube, or even scratched onto a wall for a particular pair of eyes. Some epigrams were coded so that only the intended recipient would catch the meaning, while others wore their boldness openly, daring anyone to object. On a shelf nearby, you find a collection of love poems bound in faded red leather. The script inside is elegant, but the metaphors are sharper than expected, comparing kisses to stolen figs, embraces to battles won in secret. One page even carries a small painted flourish of ivy leaves curling around the margins, as if the scribe couldn't resist decorating the words themselves. A grey-haired bookseller in a long wool tunic notices your interest. "Words travel faster than feet," he says, tapping the cover. "But they also linger longer, especially the dangerous ones." He slides the book toward you, letting you glimpse a verse that hints at a senator's fondness for someone who is very much not his wife. Whether it's truth or a poet's flourish is impossible to say. The debate among scholars remains lively over how much of this literature was autobiographical versus purely crafted for effect. Was a biting love poem always a veiled confession, or simply the Roman taste for wit, sharpened to a point? The line blurs in a city that treats rumor as both currency and sport. Before leaving, you purchase a small scroll, the ink still fresh enough to perfume the air with its faint metallic tang. The scribe wraps it in linen and ties it with a thin cord. "Don't read it here," he advises with a knowing smile. "The words are meant for lamplight and quiet." Back outside, the lane feels even narrower in the night air, the distant sound of revelers replaced by the steady scratch of quills from the shops you pass. Somewhere overhead, a shutter opens briefly, and a voice recites a line of verse into the darkness, answered by laughter from another window. You slip the scroll into your tunic and continue on, thinking about how in Rome desire can be carried as easily in ink as in a glance, and how either can leave a mark that lasts longer than the night. The street narrows into a twisting corridor of shadows, and the smell of ink and parchment fades, replaced by a pungent blend of herbs, resin, and something faintly metallic. You follow it to a small open-front shop tucked beneath an overhanging balcony. Its shelves are cluttered with clay jars, woven baskets, and bundles of dried plants hanging upside down like sleeping bats. A crooked sign carved with a crescent moon sways slightly in the breeze. Inside, a woman with hair the color of ash stirs a bronze mortar, her bracelets clinking softly. She glances up without surprise, as though she's been expecting you. "Looking for a cure?" she asks, her voice steady. "Or a cause?" One well-documented feature of Roman street life was the trade in love charms and potions, an odd marriage of superstition, folk practice, and early pharmacology. Apothecaries like this one catered not only to ailments of the body but to troubles of the heart, selling concoctions that promised to spark desire, bind affections, or drive rivals away. The woman sets down her pestle and gestures to a row of small jars. Rose oil for sweetening the mood, rue to sour it, and this, she lifts a jar no bigger than a fist. A blend from Alexandria. Works quickly, but only if you mean it. She says nothing more, letting the silence imply the rest. A curious scrap from a satirist's work notes that certain irresistible powders were nothing more than crushed cinnamon and ground almonds. Delicious, yes, but magical only in their ability to empty a buyer's purse. Still, some mixtures contained genuinely potent ingredients: opium, wine steeped with exotic spices, even rare resins that might leave the skin tingling for hours. You wander further inside, where a younger man is tying bundles of fresh mint with strips of linen. He looks up and says, "Some want to attract, some want to forget. The second is harder." He slides a small packet toward you, wrapped in waxed cloth and tied with a red thread. "Burn this at midnight if you wish to let go of someone." The debate among experts continues over whether such practices were harmless theatre or carried real physiological effects. In a city where belief itself could tip the balance of the heart, perhaps it hardly mattered. A small wooden box near the counter catches your attention. Inside are amulets carved from bone, each etched with strange symbols. The woman notices and explains, "For protection sometimes from others, sometimes from yourself." Her tone is light, but her eyes are serious. You choose a simple clay vial sealed with wax, its contents unknown. She wraps it in cloth and slips it into your hand with a quiet warning. "Remember, the gods may grant what you ask, and they may not care if it's good for you." Back outside, the night air feels cooler, the herb scent still clinging to your clothes. In the narrow lane, a couple walks past, their hands barely touching but their steps perfectly in sync. You wonder if they've ever stood where you just were, making their own bargains with plants and powders. As you move on, the vial in your pocket feels heavier than it should. In Rome, love is not only written in verse or spoken in the dark, it can be bottled, bought, and bargained for, carrying with it both promise and peril. The lane from the apothecary leads you toward a district where the buildings stand taller, their façades freshly whitewashed, and the doorways guarded by bronze knockers polished to a mirror shine. Here the air smells faintly of cedarwood and warm bread, but the sound is different. No music or shouts, only the muted rhythm of voices speaking behind closed shutters. You slow before a grand atrium house where the front door stands ajar. A servant in a plain tunic leans against the threshold, glances at you, and then disappears inside without a word. Curiosity draws you across the mosaic floor of the entryway, your footsteps echoing softly. Within, the light is dim, filtered through linen curtains, and the air is warm with the scent of spiced wine and beeswax candles. According to surviving letters and legal records, Rome's marital arrangements were often far more flexible than the official moral code suggested. The matrona, a wife of high status, could wield enormous influence socially, politically, and privately, and not all her influence was confined to her husband's household. Alliances were built not just at the Senate or the marketplace, but in whispered conversations across a dining couch. At the far end of the room, a woman in a pale saffron stola reclines on a cushioned seat, her hair pinned with a gold comb shaped like a dove. A man sits opposite her, leaning forward just enough that their knees nearly touch. His voice is low, but her laughter carries through the room light, practiced, the kind that invites more words. One striking detail from a senator's memoir hints at the subtle signals of such meetings. A hand resting too long on a wine cup, a brooch worn in a particular position, Even the arrangement of a woman's veil could be a private message to someone watching. Tonight, the matron's veil is pushed back, her face fully lit by the lamp beside her. From the corner, you see an older servant refill their cups without so much as a glance at their faces, as though he has done this 100 times before, and expects to do it 100 more. Whether he chooses not to notice or is part of the arrangement is impossible to say. Historians remain divided over how common these quiet entanglements were. Some argue they were the exception, the talk of scandalmongers looking to sell a story. Others suggest they were an open secret, tolerated so long as they caused no public embarrassment. A second man enters, a cousin perhaps, or a trusted friend. He greets the woman with a kiss on the cheek, lingering a fraction too long before turning to speak with the first man. The conversation continues in the same low tone, but the energy in the room has shifted, like a board game with new pieces suddenly in play. The matron catches you watching. She doesn't look away. Instead, she holds your gaze for the space of a breath, her expression unreadable. Then she reaches for a fig from the table, bites into it slowly, and returns her attention to her companions. A younger woman, perhaps a handmaiden, appears beside you. She offers a small dish of almonds and murmurs, "Not all alliances are sealed in the forum." Her voice is neutral, almost casual, but the weight of the words lingers. You finish the wine offered to you earlier, its spice lingering on your tongue, and step back into the cooler air of the street. Behind you, the murmur of voices resumes as though nothing had paused. The door closes quietly, leaving the house's secrets behind its polished bronze and painted walls. And you, once again, are walking Rome's streets with the sense that in this city, every open door has another story waiting behind it, if you choose to step inside. The street bends sharply and opens into a smaller square where the stone underfoot is worn smooth by centuries of steps. Here, the walls are closer, the upper stories almost touching, and the lamplight paints the plaster in warm gold. At first glance, it looks like any quiet corner of the city at night until you notice the writing. It's everywhere. Faded lines scratched into the plaster, letters painted in red and black, crude drawings and short, sharp phrases carved deep into the stone. Some are old enough to be half lost to time, others fresh enough that the lime still flakes from the letters. Archaeological records, especially from Pompeii, reveal that graffiti was a favored medium for the Romans to express wit, rivalry, politics, and desire. Walls became public diaries, confessionals, and marketplaces of the heart. Some inscriptions praised lovers in extravagant verse, others mocked rivals, and still others promised favors in exchange for a discreet meeting place. You run your fingers over one line painted in neat capitals, Livia. Your eyes conquer more than Caesar's armies. A little farther along, in a quick, slanted hand, someone has scrawled, "I was here with Marcus." He knows. The two messages face each other like opponents in an argument. One fragment of a scribe's memoir notes that lovers sometimes hired literate street writers to inscribe messages on their behalf, especially if they wanted them to be legible, poetic, or particularly biting. The illiterate could still join in, marking hearts, symbols, or even handprints. A man in a leather apron is leaning against the wall, watching you read. He gestures toward a patch of fresh writing. "New today," he says, and already the neighbors are talking. The message reads, "To the one who stole my necklace, you stole my heart too." Whether it's meant as humor or genuine confession, the smudged paint suggests haste, maybe even nerves. Scholars disagree over whether such graffiti was taken seriously or treated as entertainment. Standing here, you can feel how it might be both public enough to be shared, private enough to carry a hidden meaning known only to two. At the far end of the square, a set of steps leads to a narrow alley. The walls here are even denser with markings, layered until the letters overlap. In the flickering lamplight, you spot crude drawings of ships, gladiators, and scenes that leave little to the imagination. A particularly bold image shows a figure pouring wine for another, reclining on a couch above it, the inscription, "Better than Bacchus himself." You pause at one wall where a small wooden box hangs by a cord. A slip of parchment pokes out. ink still drying. Someone must have left it minutes ago. You're tempted to pull it free, but the sound of footsteps in the alley behind you makes you step away. A hooded figure passes without looking at you, disappearing into the square. The smell of fresh paint lingers as you make your way out, the walls closing in behind you like the covers of an unfinished book. Back on the main street, the night feels different, as if the city has been whispering to itself, and you've just overheard a fragment. In Rome, it seems, even the bricks have something to say if you know how to read them. The alley from the graffiti-covered square widens into a courtyard awash in warm lamplight, the kind that glows from every corner without a single shadow breaking it. Long, low tables have been set up beneath a canopy of woven reeds, their surfaces crowded with platters of roasted game birds, bowls of olives gleaming with oil, wheels of cheese sliced into generous wedges, and baskets spilling over with figs and pomegranates. The smell is intoxicating smoke, cinnamon, and the faint sweetness of honey. You've stumbled into the preparations for a private banquet, the sort that might stretch from sunset to sunrise without a moment's lull. Writers of the time described such evenings as both indulgence and theatre. The host not only fed his guests but staged an experience that unfolded in carefully timed courses, each dish paired with conversation, entertainment, and the subtle shifting of alliances. A slave carrying a tray of wine cups brushes past you, murmuring for you to take one. The wine is deep red, sweetened with dates, and just enough spice to warm the back of your throat. Across the courtyard, the host, a man in a crimson-bordered toga, claps his hands, signaling the first course. Servants enter in pairs, each bearing a dish that seems as much display as nourishment. A roast peacock with its feathers artfully reattached, a platter of fish arranged to look as though they're still swimming, and a pyramid of honey cakes dusted with edible gold. Guests murmur their appreciation, leaning close to one another to trade comments as the feast begins. One colourful detail from a satirist's account recalls that some hosts placed small surprises inside certain dishes, nuts dyed with saffron, tiny carved tokens hidden in bread rolls meant to spark laughter or playful wagers. Tonight, a woman at the far end of the table cuts into a fig to reveal a folded scrap of parchment. She reads it silently, smiles, and tucks it into her sleeve. The scholarly view is split on whether these banquets were truly about the food, or whether the meal was just a convenient frame for other indulgences. Watching the guests here, you notice that while the courses are impressive, the real energy lies in the glances, the shared cups, the lingering touches when a hand passes a plate. A musician with a small lyre begins to play, his melody soft enough not to compete with the conversation. Near him, a storyteller rises and begins weaving a tale about a fisherman who falls in love with a goddess disguised as a mortal. The story is full of sly humour and double meanings, earning chuckles from some guests and quiet nods from others who catch the deeper implication. You take another sip of wine and notice that the seating isn't random. Certain guests are placed beside those they might most wish to impress or perhaps most wish to persuade. A pair of senators lean toward each other, speaking so quietly you can only see their lips moving. Beside them, a woman in a gown of pale blue laughs at something whispered by her companion, though her eyes never leave the man across the table. In the center of the courtyard, a servant refills lamps with oil, the flames flaring briefly. For a moment, the light sharpens every detail, the glint of a gold ring, the curve of a smile, the faint red stain of wine on someone's lips before settling back into its softer glow. As the second course is served, the host raises his cup. "To Rome," he says, "and to the knights that remind us why she is worth defending." The guests echo the toast, and the music swells. Later, as you step back into the cooler air beyond the courtyard, the sounds of laughter and clinking cups follow you into the street. You realize that in this city, a banquet is never just a meal, it's a stage, and every guest is playing a role. The street narrows again, and the laughter from the banquet fades into a low hum of conversation drifting from a shaded portico ahead. You slow your pace, catching fragments of words: pleasure, virtue, freedom spoken in the deliberate tones of people arguing for the sake of sharpening their ideas. The space opens into a small garden lit by hanging lamps, the air heavy with the scent of rosemary and night-blooming jasmine. 4 men recline on low couches arranged in a semicircle. Between them, a low table holds cups of watered wine, a platter of olives, and a scroll unrolled just enough to reveal a few lines of careful Greek script. One of the men, a broad-shouldered figure with a trimmed beard, taps the scroll as he speaks. Epicurus teaches that pleasure is the absence of pain. But tell me, he glances toward a younger man across from him, what is a life without desire? Roman sources record that philosophical debates on love and pleasure were not confined to lecture halls. They flourished in gardens, baths, and private courtyards, often late into the night when wine loosened tongues and the boundaries between theory and confession began to blur. The younger man smiles, leaning back against the cushions. A life without desire? He says. That is the life of a stone, and I have no wish to be carved into a statue just yet. His remark earns laughter from the group, but also a raised eyebrow from the bearded man. One curious passage from a Stoic's personal notebook notes that such debates often used hypothetical lovers as examples, though sometimes the names were just thinly disguised references to real people present in the conversation. You suspect tonight's hypotheticals carry the same double edge. A third man, wiry and quick-eyed, refills his cup and interrupts. Desire is a trap. It makes fools of the wise and cowards of the brave. Better to master it than to chase it. His words carry conviction, but you notice his gaze lingering a moment too long on the servant who passes behind him, setting down a fresh platter of figs. The discussion turns sharper, with the Epicurean arguing that physical pleasure can be virtuous if pursued without harm, and the Stoic countering that virtue itself should be the goal, not the feeling it brings. A cynic at the end of the table snorts into his wine and mutters something about philosophers who preach moderation only after they've had their fill. Experts still debate whether these gatherings were primarily about refining ideas or about using philosophy as a social performance, a way to demonstrate wit, charm, and learning to those whose opinion mattered. Judging by the laughter and the occasional sidelong glance, tonight's meeting seems to be serving both purposes equally well. A servant appears with a small amphora, pouring a darker, richer wine into each cup. The bearded man raises his in a mock toast, to pleasure whether in the body, the mind, or the soul, and to the arguments that make it taste sweeter. As the night deepens, the garden's shadows grow longer, the lamp flames flickering in the breeze. You rise quietly, stepping out through the ivy-covered archway back into the street. Behind you, the voices fade to a murmur, still circling the same questions that have been asked for centuries. In Rome, even philosophy is laced with the pulse of desire, and the debate over whether to master it or let it lead the way is one the city never truly settles. The ivy-covered arch gives way to a slope leading toward the river, where the breeze carries the damp, mineral scent of water mixed with the faint tang of olive oil burning in nearby lamps. The streets here are quieter, though not empty shadows pass in pairs, and the occasional flicker of gold on a bracelet or earring catches the lamplight. Overhead, the stars blur in the haze, but one glows steady, framed by the rooftops, Jupiter, bright and unmoving. You round a corner into a narrow market street where stalls are shuttered, their awnings tied back. A single table remains open, draped with indigo cloth and covered in wax tablets, polished bronze armillary spheres, and bowls of smooth river stones etched with symbols. Behind it sits an older man with a short, silver beard, arranging a stack of star charts. Accounts from the period note that astrology was deeply woven into Roman life, not merely for predicting harvests or military campaigns, but for guiding matters of the heart. Lovers timed meetings by the moon's phase, and some refused advances until the stars aligned in their favor. The astrologer looks up as you approach, eyes sharp despite the dim light. You have the look of someone waiting for the right moment, he says. His Latin is measured, precise. He gestures to a stool opposite him and slides a wax tablet toward you. Tell me the day and hour you first met the one you're thinking of. You give him a date, and he begins scratching figures into the wax with a stylus. Venus in trine with Jupiter, he murmurs, favorable for beginnings. But Mars was ascendant, so there will be conflict, or great passion, or both. He glances up with a faint smile. Perhaps the same thing. One intriguing detail preserved in a poet's private letters is that some Romans carried small lead tablets, inscribed with favorable horoscopes, keeping them close as charms. Others paid to have a rival star's read, in a way that foretold misfortune, hoping to sour their prospects in love or politics. The astrologer produces a small bronze disc engraved with constellations and turns it in the lamplight. For a fee, I can mark the next night your stars will favor you, he says. His tone is casual, but the offer hangs between you like a suspended coin. From a doorway nearby, a woman watches. She wears a hooded cloak, but the edge of a gold hairpin glints in her hair. She catches your eye for an instant before disappearing inside, as if to remind you that the right moment might be closer than the stars suggest. Scholarly opinion remains divided on whether such consultations were sought out of genuine belief or as a way to add ceremony and a touch of inevitability to decisions already made. The way the astrologer's hand lingers over the wax tablet makes you think it's not entirely about fate. He hands you a folded scrap of parchment, its surface dusted lightly with crushed lavender. When the moon is half and Jupiter is clear in the east, he says, "Go where the river bends, and you may find what you seek." You tuck the parchment into your belt and step back into the cool night. The river's dark surface shimmers faintly ahead, and for a moment you feel the pull to follow it now, to test whether the stars are truly waiting for you, or whether, like so much in Rome, they're just another stage for desire to play upon. The astrologer's words still hum in your mind as you leave the riverfront and follow a street lined with small shadowed shrines. Their niches are crowded with clay figurines, some weathered into anonymity, others painted in vivid reds and blues that have somehow resisted the years. A faint smoke of incense drifts from one open doorway, curling upward in lazy spirals. You step inside to find a room no larger than a market stall. Its walls are covered with painted panels depicting figures unfamiliar even in Rome. A woman with a lion's head, a man with the horns of a bull, a winged child holding a bowl of fire. The air smells of cedar resin and something sharper, almost metallic. At the center, a bronze brazier glows, tended by a man in a dark linen robe. Roman accounts speak often of imported cults, religions, and rites brought from Egypt, Syria, and beyond that, promise transformation, protection, or ecstasy to those willing to step outside the state-sanctioned gods. Some drew curious onlookers, others gathered devoted followers who met in secret, their rituals whispered about in the streets. The priest greets you with a nod and offers a small cup of liquid dark as ink. "To see what cannot be seen," he says, his accent marking him as a foreigner. You sip cautiously. It tastes bitter, earthy, with a heat that blooms at the back of your throat. One lesser-known inscription found in an abandoned shrine records that certain initiations involve not only prayers, but acts designed to bind the initiate to the god's will through oaths, symbolic touches, and the sharing of scented oils said to carry the deity's presence. Whether the binding was physical, emotional, or imagined, seems to have been left for the initiate to decide. Around the brazier, 3 women kneel, their heads bowed. The priest walks behind them, sprinkling a fine powder into their hair, the scent of it sweet and intoxicating. He speaks in a language you don't know, the syllables rhythmic, almost like chanting. The women's shoulders rise and fall in unison, as though breathing to the same beat. Experts remain divided on whether these imported rites were seen as threatening to Roman morals or simply absorbed into the city's endless appetite for novelty. The truth, you suspect, is that their mystery was part of their power. What is hidden is always more tempting than what is known. The priest looks at you again. "You are only passing through," he says, not as a question. "But the god may pass through you as well." His gaze is steady, his meaning unclear, and before you can respond, he turns back to the women at the brazier. You step out into the street, the night air cool after the shrine's heat. The taste of the bitter drink still lingers, mingled with the faint perfume of the powder. Somewhere behind you, the chanting resumes, folding back into the rhythm of the city. As you walk away, you wonder whether what you saw was worship, performance, or something in between. In Rome, the difference may not matter so long as it stirs the heart enough to be remembered. The scent of cedar and incense fades as you move deeper into the maze of streets, where the lamps are fewer and the air feels heavier. You turn a corner and find yourself before the Basilica Julia, its marble columns looming in the moonlight. By day, this is the bustling seat of legal proceedings. By night, its broad steps are almost empty, save for a pair of watchmen leaning on their spears. In the distance, you hear the sharp echo of sandals on stone. A small group approaches a man in a dark toga, flanked by two others carrying scroll cases. Behind them, a woman in a crimson pallor walks with her head held high, her face half hidden by the shadow of the portico. The watchmen straighten as they pass, but do not speak. Roman law was famously entangled with matters of love and desire. Certain liaisons, especially those that crossed class lines or involved a married woman, could bring not only scandal but legal ruin. Accusations of adultery were heard in these very halls, the punishments ranging from exile to confiscation of property, and in rare cases, death. You slip into the basilica's shadow as the group ascends the steps. Through the open doors, the lamplight reveals a chamber lined with benches and mosaics. A magistrate sits at the far end, flanked by two scribes. The man in the toga speaks first, unrolling a scroll and reading in clipped, precise Latin. The woman's expression remains calm, but her hands are clasped tightly at her waist. One revealing note from a surviving legal tablet records that trials for illicit affairs could become public spectacles, crowds gathering to watch, gossip spreading through the city before the verdict was even given. Here, though, the audience is absent. This is a private hearing, and its secrecy suggests that the names involved carry enough weight to demand discretion. The magistrate listens without interruption, then gestures for the woman to speak. Her voice is steady, but there's an edge to it, a measured defiance. She denies the accusation, stating that the supposed witness mistook a chance meeting for something more. The scribe's stylus scratches across the wax tablet, preserving every word. Scholars have long debated whether such cases were truly about morality or whether they were political weapons tools to tarnish reputations and shift the balance of power. Watching the careful way the magistrate weighs each phrase, you suspect it's both. After a pause, the magistrate orders the proceedings adjourned until morning. The parties leave without acknowledging one another, their footsteps echoing through the basilica. The woman passes close enough that you catch the faint scent of myrtle on her cloak, a fragrance traditionally linked to Venus. Whether it's coincidence or a quiet statement, you can't be sure. When the doors close, the basilica falls silent again, its great columns standing guard over 1,000 whispered accusations from centuries past. You step back into the cool night air, the stone under your feet still warm from the day's sun. In Rome, justice and desire often share the same stage, and the verdict depends as much on who's watching as on what's true. The marble steps of the basilica give way to a quieter side street where the walls close in, the air warmer and scented faintly with beeswax and smoke. A single lamp burns over a modest doorway flanked by tall clay jars, their lids sealed with red wax. The emblem above the door, a stylized wax tablet and stylus, marks it as the workshop of a scribe. You duck inside to find shelves lined with scrolls, some wrapped in cloth, others bare and curling at the edges. The room is warm from a small brazier in the corner, its coals glowing softly. At a long table, a scribe in a faded blue tunic bends over a wax tablet, his hand moving with deliberate precision. He doesn't look up when he says, "If you're here for a letter, tell me who it's for and what you want it to do." Letters in Rome were more than mere messages they could be. Declarations of loyalty, weapons of persuasion, or delicate threads spun between lovers. Historians note that the tone, choice of words, and even the color of the ribbon used to tie a letter could convey meaning beyond the text itself. You glance at the shelves and notice several small stacks tied with pale blue thread. The scribe follows your gaze. Those, he says, are for a woman who prefers her words to arrive scented with lavender. It makes the recipient remember her before they even break the seal. One remarkable detail preserved in an anthology of private correspondence is that lovers sometimes embedded hidden messages between lines of poetry or behind seemingly innocent phrases that would mean nothing to anyone but the intended reader. A line about the weather might mask a meeting place. A compliment on a garden's roses might hint at the hour of an encounter. The scribe finishes a line and turns the tablet for you to see. The words are formal, polite, but the tilt of certain letters is deliberate just enough to form a secondary message when read in sequence. The art, he says, is to make the message invisible to everyone but the one it's meant for. Experts remain divided over how widespread this practice was. Some argue it was a romantic flourish reserved for the elite, while others believe it thrived across the city, especially where discretion was essential. On a side table, a shallow dish of sealing wax waits beside a brass stamp, carved with the image of two intertwined vines. The scribe pours a trickle of red wax onto a folded letter, presses the stamp into it, and lifts it away to reveal the mark. That one, he says with a faint smile, is for a senator who prefers his private business to look like fine wine. He slides a fresh sheet of parchment toward you. I can write for you, if you have something worth saying. His tone makes it clear that in this room, worth saying might mean something very different from what it means in the forum. You leave with no letter of your own, but the scent of warm wax and the weight of those hidden messages follow you back into the street. Somewhere in the city tonight, a folded scroll will change the course of someone's life, or at least the shape of their next morning. The warm scent of wax fades as you make your way toward a part of the city where the streets are narrower, the walls streaked with soot from years of lamp smoke. You follow a lane that twists like a question until it opens into a courtyard enclosed on all sides by high stone walls. The sound here is different low laughter, the creak of wooden doors, and the faint splash of water in a fountain that catches the lamplight like molten gold. To your left stands a two-story building with a broad doorway framed by painted columns. The plaster around it is decorated with faded frescoes, figures reclining on couches, sharing cups of wine, draped in fabrics the color of ripe plums. Above the door, a small terracotta plaque bears the outline of a reclining woman, her hand raised in greeting. You've arrived at one of the city's lupanaria, the brothels that made Pompeii infamous even in its own time. Archaeological records make clear that such places were more than just rooms for hire. They were designed with intention, narrow halls lined with cubicula, each space adorned with frescoes that doubled as advertisements for the specialties offered within. Some were crude, others surprisingly artful, but all served as a kind of visual contract between patron and worker. A woman in a deep red tunic greets you at the entrance. Her hair is pinned high, streaked with gold powder that glints in the lamplight. Without asking your name, she gestures toward the interior, where the walls are alive with color-painted scenes of feasts, gardens, and figures in poses that leave little to interpretation. One unusual detail noted in tavern ledgers is that some brothels charged more for rooms whose frescoes were considered particularly well executed, as though the art itself could heighten the experience. Looking around, you see why. In one panel, a couple reclines beneath an arbor heavy with grapes, the painter having taken great care with the folds of the cloth and the gleam of the wine. The air is warm and heavy with the scent of oil lamps mixed with perfume. Voices drift from behind curtained doorways, soft laughter, the clink of a cup being set down, the shuffle of feet on mosaic floors. A servant moves past carrying a tray of bread and olives, a reminder that in Rome, even here, hospitality was part of the service. The debate among scholars continues over whether these establishments were primarily visited by laborers and sailors, or whether the elite also slipped through their doors under cover of anonymity. Judging by the quality of the frescoes and the gold pins in the hair of the woman at the door, this is no place for the desperate alone. In the central hall, a low couch is set beside the fountain. A man reclines there, speaking to two women whose laughter flows as easily as the water. Their conversation drifts between flirtation and business. The shifts so seamless you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. You linger just long enough to take in the atmosphere, the warmth, the colors, the subtle choreography of movement and glance, before stepping back into the courtyard. The sound of the fountain follows you out, blending with the murmur of other streets just beyond the walls. In Rome, even the most transactional of spaces carried its own form of theatre, and the stage here was as carefully painted as any in the Forum. The night feels thicker as you leave the courtyard, the scent of lamp oil and perfume giving way to the dry tang of dust and leather. The street slopes downward toward the city's edge, where the glow of torches flares high above the rooftops. You follow the sound of distant cheering until it swells into a roar, and then you see it the outer walls of the amphitheatre, lit like a crown against the dark. By day, this is the arena where gladiators earn their fame in the sand. But tonight, the crowd is gone. The gates are closed, and the noise comes from somewhere else, a small training yard tucked beside the arena itself. Here, under the light of a few flickering braziers, men move with the restless energy of fighters who haven't yet learned to sleep after combat. Historical accounts tell us that gladiators occupied a strange place in Roman society, despised as slaves or outcasts by some, adored as living idols by others. Off the sand, they attracted a level of attention that sometimes eclipsed senators and generals, their allure sharpened by the danger they carried with them. Near the fence, a young fighter leans against a post, laughing with a pair of women dressed in simple but well-cut tunics. His hair is damp from training, his arms marked with faint scars. He catches your glance and grins as if to acknowledge the curiosity that follows men like him everywhere. An unusual note in a satirical poem describes how some admirers sought tokens from their favorite gladiators, strips of cloth worn in the arena, even drops of sweat collected on wool as charms for luck or passion. Whether superstition or pure infatuation, the desire to possess a fragment of the fighter's life blurred the line between trophy and talisman. A trainer calls the men back to the yard, and they begin sparring with wooden swords, the thud of each strike echoing in the quiet streets. A few onlookers remain merchants, travelers, perhaps even disguised members of the elite watching with a fascination that has little to do with technique. Experts are divided on whether the gladiators' offstage encounters were encouraged by their laniste, the owners who profited from their fame. Some argue it kept morale high. Others believe it risked scandal or distraction. Judging by the easy smiles and lack of interruption tonight, the rules here seem flexible. One of the fighters breaks away from the group and sits on the edge of a low wall, wiping his face with a cloth. A woman approaches, places a small clay jug beside him, and says something too quiet for you to hear. He looks up, nods once, and takes her hand in his for a brief moment before returning to the yard. The braziers hiss as someone adds fresh oil, their light catching the pale scars and polished helmets hanging on the wall. You turn away, knowing that while the arena belongs to the crowd, this small yard belongs to moments no audience will ever see. As you walk back toward the main road, the echo of wooden swords follows you, rhythmic and steady, like the heartbeat of a city that never truly sleeps. The steady thud of practice swords fades behind you as you follow a side street lined with shuttered wine shops. The moonlight here feels sharper, catching on every uneven cobblestone. Ahead, a group of men in dark cloaks stands in a half-circle around a torchbearer, their voices low but urgent. As you approach, the torchlight reveals the gleam of a laurel wreath worked into the clasp of one man's cloak. You know the face from coins and statues. Commodus, the emperor himself. Or at least, the rumors are right. The figure before you is not in a palace tonight but standing in the open street, smiling like a man on the verge of breaking his own rules. Surviving accounts paint Commodus as a ruler who blurred the lines between spectacle and governance. Known for fighting in the arena, he enjoyed turning public entertainment into personal theatre, often placing himself at the center of both admiration and scandal. Yet what drew even sharper whispers were the private indulgences that followed such appearances, stories of encounters as calculated as any political maneuver. He dismisses most of his retinue with a flick of his fingers, keeping only two close attendants. One steps forward to hand him a cup of wine. The other exchanges a brief glance with a tall woman waiting in the shadows. She emerges into the light, her gown the color of deep garnet, her hair pinned with a gold comb shaped like a lion's head. One curious fragment from a senator's private correspondence claims that Commodus had a taste for orchestrating his meetings, like staged dramas choosing public settings with just enough privacy to fuel rumors without confirming them. Watching now, you can see the method in the way the torchbearer adjusts the light so it falls across the woman's face but leaves Commodus partly in shadow. The emperor says something to her that you can't hear, and she smiles, not a shy smile, but the sort that suggests she's fully aware of the weight of his attention. They walk together toward a gated courtyard, the attendants hanging back just enough to make the pair appear alone. Experts still argue whether these stories about Commodus's liaisons were truth, exaggeration, or outright invention by political enemies. But seeing him here, moving through the city like an actor in his own play, you understand why such tales found fertile ground. From your spot at the corner, you watch as the gates open and swallow the two of them into darkness. The torchbearer remains outside, leaning casually against the wall, his eyes scanning the street not for threats, but for witnesses. When you finally turn to leave, the image stays with you, the ruler of Rome slipping between the roles of emperor and leading man without missing a step. In this city, power doesn't just command obedience, it commands an audience. The streets grow louder again as you follow the slope toward the Forum, but the energy is different, more chaotic, almost giddy. Laughter spills from every corner, and the air is thick with the smell of roasting chestnuts, sweet wine, and wood smoke. Ahead, the marble columns are draped in garlands of pine and holly, and colored ribbons flutter from balconies. You've stumbled into Saturnalia. By day, this winter festival overturns Rome's normal order, but by night, the reversal is complete. Slaves wear their masters' tunics, senators serve drinks to their household staff, and the city moves in a kind of joyful disarray. The formal greetings of the Forum are replaced with open embraces and mock titles shouted down the streets. Writers of the period agree that Saturnalia was the great equalizer, if only for a handful of days each year. It was a sanctioned inversion of roles, where the usual restrictions on behavior loosened almost to the point of vanishing. Tonight, that looseness is everywhere in the way strangers share cups without asking names, in the bursts of song echoing from side streets, in the sheer density of smiles. Near the steps of a temple, a group of men and women sit in a circle passing a single dice cup. One man in a senator's toga loses a round and is promptly ordered to sing, which he does, but in a bawdy verse that makes his companions howl with laughter. A woman wearing a wreath of ivy leans over to refill his cup, spilling half the wine on his lap and laughing harder when he doesn't flinch. One curious note from a surviving household ledger is that gifts exchanged during Saturnalia often carried hidden messages. A wax figurine of a gladiator might hint at strength or defiance. A pair of dice could suggest risk or temptation. You see a young woman hand a man a small wrapped bundle, and his grin when he unwraps a miniature silver key suggests the meaning is far from innocent. The debate among historians remains whether Saturnalia was truly a release from social tension or simply a carefully contained performance that reinforced the usual order once it ended. Watching the mingling here, you can imagine both. The freedom is real enough in the moment, but the awareness that it will end tomorrow gives it a certain bittersweet edge. A man in a slave's short tunic approaches you, carrying a tray of honey cakes shaped like small animals. "Eat," he says with a grin, "and remember tomorrow I serve no one." His confidence is easy, born of the 1 week each year when he can speak as boldly as any citizen. In the center of the square, musicians play a fast, playful rhythm. A pair of older women grab each other's hands and dance, their wreaths slipping sideways on their heads. Around them, People chant mock proclamations in imitation of the Senate, declaring absurd new laws for the night. All wine must be free, all kisses must be shared, and the crowd cheers each one. As you slip away into a side street, the music and laughter trail after you. Somewhere behind, the mock senators are still shouting, the ivy wreaths are still tilting, and for tonight at least, Rome is a city where no one stays in their usual place. The sounds of Saturnalia fade behind you as you take a quieter route toward the river. The streets here are lined with narrow, shuttered houses, their upper stories leaning so close that the sky appears only in slivers. You might have missed the small temple entirely, if not for the flicker of a single oil lamp by its entrance. Its door is open just enough to let the scent of incense spill into the street. Inside, the walls are painted with scenes of feasts and garlands. But the mood here is not celebratory. At the center stands a low marble altar, covered in fresh laurel leaves and small clay cups of wine. A group of women in dark tunics kneels around it, their heads bowed. You hear quiet chanting, low and slow, more like a hum than a song. Ancient records, rare and hesitant, describe certain funerary rites in Rome, where mourning and longing intertwined. In some traditions, a departed lover was honored not only with prayers but with tokens of the life shared, a cup from which both had drunk, a fragment of clothing, even a lock of hair. These objects were left at the altar as gifts for the spirit, symbolic acts meant to keep the bond unbroken. One of the women lifts her head, and you see her holding a small bronze mirror, its polished surface catching the lamplight. She places it carefully on the altar beside the wine cups, whispering something you can't catch. A fellow mourner touches her shoulder in silence. An unusual entry in a temple caretaker's journal mentions that some mourners returned long after the burial, visiting the altar at night to speak to the dead as though the conversation had never ended. Whether this was ritual, grief, or an expression of desire for what could no longer be, the record doesn't say. The chanting stops. Each woman takes a sip of wine from a communal cup before pouring the remainder over the laurel leaves. The wine darkens the marble, the scent of it rising to mix with the smoke of the incense. No one weeps. The silence that follows feels heavier than crying. Historians still debate whether these nighttime gatherings blurred the lines between sacred mourning and private indulgence. Standing here, you sense that to those present, the distinction was irrelevant. Grief and desire are both acts of holding on. You step back into the street as the women begin their final bow toward the altar. The night air is cool against your face, carrying the faint aroma of incense with you as you walk. Somewhere behind you, a door closes softly, sealing the temple's light away from the sleeping city. In Rome, even death could be a mirror that reflected longing back at the living. As you walk deeper into the city's labyrinth, the sounds of the night grow distant, leaving only the steady rhythm of your footsteps against the cobblestones. The lanterns grow fewer now, their light weaker, and the night feels thicker with the silence. Ahead, the outline of a narrow bridge appears, the stone barely visible, beneath a coating of ivy and moss. The river beneath it is dark and still, its surface reflecting the faint shimmer of distant stars. The bridge leads into a quieter part of Rome, one where the marketplace is absent, where the streets are narrower and the houses seem to be crammed tightly together as if to keep the noise of the city at bay. Here, you find a small fountain, its water barely a trickle, but the space around it feels sacred, untouched by the celebrations or scandals that have marked the night. A lone figure stands beside the fountain, their silhouette barely visible in the dim light. As you draw nearer, the figure turns slightly, and you recognize the hooded outline of a priestess. She is standing at the edge of the fountain, her hands resting lightly on the stone basin, her face framed by the soft glow of a dying lantern. In Rome, the temple and the street often collided, their spaces blurred by the fluidity of public and private life. Here, it is clear that she, too, is a part of both the sacred and the profane. She does not speak but simply nods toward the water, as though inviting you to witness something only the river knows. A small inscription etched on the side of the fountain catches your eye, its letters worn with time. In the stillness, all things are seen. Whether the words were left as a prayer, a warning, or a forgotten statement of philosophy, they seem to capture the essence of Rome itself, an empire where everything and nothing exist in perpetual motion, all hidden in plain sight. You approach the fountain, dipping your fingers into the cool water. The ripples scatter outward, but they quickly settle, leaving no trace. For a moment, you wonder whether this is the city's true essence, the fleeting moments that pass unnoticed by most, the quiet places where the soul might come to rest, and the spaces where desire and duty, love and loss, all merge into the steady flow of time. The priestess watches you for a moment longer, her expression unreadable, then silently moves away, disappearing into the shadows like a ghost. Her departure feels like the closing of a door, and for a second, the air seems emptier without her presence. You stand there, letting the night wrap itself around you, until the sound of the river and the distant hum of the city outside the bridge pull you back into motion. The stars above are dimmer now, swallowed by the clouds that have gathered as though to obscure the city's endless gaze. In Rome, even the quietest moments are not truly private. Everything is observed. And yet, as you walk away from the fountain, you can't help but feel that some things, some fleeting desires, some brief connections are left to flow away with the river, as though they were never meant to be seen at all.